This is the PDP, or evaluation, for the first half of my subject module. My chosen genre is illustrative figurative ceramics. At the beginning of my work, we were given the opportunity to work alongside the museum and the Fragile exhibition that will be going on there, and I didn't want to pass up this opportunity to work with either the museum or with the Fragile exhibition, and I really wanted to bring the two together and look at them both in different ways, but at the same time. But I was a little bit scared by the idea of starting a new project, so I started with some very hands-on things. I made some subcast bowls, I looked at textures and features and the different things about clay that I enjoy, just to get the ball rolling, but I think at the same time it slowed me down because I was looking at the Fragile exhibition alongside it. I got a little bit sidetracked by that and I wanted to look more deeply into it instead of looking at the ceramic work that I was working on. So I don't think I started the project off very evenly, very clearly, but eventually I managed to fall into the right place and get the ball rolling properly and really start thinking about the concepts behind my ideas. So while I was looking at the work in the Fragile exhibition, I was also looking at the way that we use fragility within our society, the way that cultures and genders can be orientated towards fragility, and the way that we think of ourselves as fragile, despite the fact that we're not fragile. But in many ways we are fragile in a mental sense and in a psychological sense. We crumple very easily when being confronted by society. And as I was working with clay, as I was starting to make articulated figures, I found that they themselves crumpled very easily under the weight of themselves, under gravity, under the forces that were acting upon them while they were very wet and they were very easy to manipulate. I made them too tall and they kind of started to collapse and started to crumble, and some of them needed props just to keep them upright. But I really enjoyed this idea, this concept that was starting to form in my brain as they kind of crumpled underneath their own weight. I loved the way they looked, the way that they were kind of helpless, and I really enjoyed looking at them and thinking about what I could do with that figure if I put it in a different context. So if I submerged it in water, could that water then be society's expectations upon the figure, and the figure is very crumbled and almost drowning underneath society's expectations. And I think that is a metaphor that is more than often used when someone can't cope with the level of pressure put upon them, in the same way that the clay can't cope with the level of pressure put upon it by gravity and by the forces acting upon it. So I definitely wanted to work with the figure, even though I hadn't started looking at figurative artists yet. I'd only really stumbled across Claire Canine and Michael Flynn and started looking at their figures in a kind of way that inputted into my project, but not entirely. I was just kind of fiddling about with clay, fiddling about with some ideas, experimenting really. But when Claire took us to the museum to look at different artists and think about what we liked, I went downstairs into the natural history section and looked at the fish in jars, because I've been thinking about working with water or resin or something to submerge figures. I thought, why not look at stuff that's already submerged within the context of the museum, which is where I wanted my work to be based. I was looking at some fish in jars, things that can't be preserved any other way, that have to be put into these containers and contained that way so that they can be studied in later times or whenever we need to look at them again. And as I was doing this, I was thinking about how I could do the same thing with my figures, how I could preserve them, how I could put them into jars to make it look like they were these preserved animals. And by starting to think about that, I started to think about the cultural implications of that, the societal implications of that, other things that have branched off society outside of preservation, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I thought of a few quotes from Catcher in the Rye that really honed in on how he wanted everything in society to be preserved, like behind glass, to kept the same, to never change, just so he could keep up with it. And that societal pressure that's explored within Catcher in the Rye. And other things like the new version of Frankenstein that's come out on the West End. Thinking about Christy Brown's work with cultures and how she creates little figures that are to do with the cultural expectations or the way cultures present themselves, and how they almost look like dolls, how they almost look like people preserved on a little row. I started exploring all of these different branches of preservation while at the same time thinking about my own ideas, thinking about how I could really continue this work. But at the same time, when I was in the museum, I was looking at Michael Flynn's work, his very expressive figures that are all about myths and legends, all about folklore, And at the same time looking at the way he uses glazes, the way he uses slips to create little flecks in the skin to almost highlight what each figure is doing in this crowded display. So I love the way he represented myths and legends. He pretty much just created a scenario in clay and very much adventurously used the clay to depict each scene. And I wanted to look at each individual character. I wanted to pick up the piece and look at each of the individual figures themselves and the way that they were sitting or crouching or eating or shouting or whatever it was that they were doing within the scene. So I started to connect the ideas that Michael Flynn had explored within folklore and myths and legends with the things that I've been looking at the museum the same day, the jarred fish and things like that. At the same time I was looking at things like Anthony Gormley's sculptures, his field, and the way that each individual human is preserved in their act of sculpting and their act of putting it into the museum and being seen by thousands of other people and always being part of it and being preserved within this artwork forever, for as long as that artwork survives past their own life. And that idea that artists can preserve themselves with their work, and that idea that artists can be immortalised within their work, much like Shakespeare is, by still being around today even though he's been dead 400 years. At the same time I was looking at Catherine Morling's work, because she kind of resonates with this entire piece. Her work very much slab built, simplistic things, pencil sketch lines, all very simplistic but depicting things from a museum, the taxidermied birds within domes and the way that they are made out of clay but in many ways resonate with what is inside the museum, what is inside Victorian housing. You know, all these different dead animals but still beautiful in their own ways, and congealing this and all of the other things that I've been looking at and considering self-preservation, considering human preservation, considering cultural preservation, the preservation of artwork, the preservation of animals, all of these different ways of preserving things, thinking about Catcher in the Rye and the way that he wants to preserve things so that it can never change, and those societal expectations upon a person, and looking at Frankenstein and the new Frankenstein West End play that's come out, and all of these different ways of preserving the same myth, the same fantastic beast within one work, and then within thousands of others that are spurred on by that one piece. And also the way that Frankenstein himself is brought back to life, brought back from the dead and preserved in that way. And all of these different things, and at the same time looking at figurative and sculptural and illustrative work like Lee Gorin and Crystal Moray, and the way that they depict people, the way that they very simply do faces or elegantly dress people or create wild headdresses out of animals and things like that, the very illustrative ways that they work, and then bringing them all together within my head to create my own idea. So I wanted to work with preservation, and I wanted to work with resin or some other way of depicting the jarred animals, and I thought if I could create a mould and then have one singular piece of resin with a thing inside it, that would be a particularly aesthetic pleasing way of going about this project. Doesn't seem like the most likely way, because resin is an expensive thing and it's also very hard to get hold of, and it would be a very long process to fill something this size with resin, but still something that I wish to move forward with, even making my own moulds and filling the resin up myself, finding a ventilated space in which to do it, and these are all things that obviously are different implications towards the way I can work and the size that I can work with and things like that. These different consequences are making a difference to the way that I'm working, but I think that the thing that I want to move forward with, rather than the context and rather with the concept itself, is the way that I'm working, the way that I'm sculpting things, the way that I'm glazing things, the glazes that I use, maybe even the clay that I'm using, the clay body, because at the moment I'm working with low fire clays and I can't create things like lava glazes on low fire clays very easily, and I kind of want to. And all of these different things that are drawing together to create a myth preserved within a museum style exhibition. That's all I really want. So I want to create individual pieces that will all be set out together in one corner of a room or one corner of an exhibition or a space in an exhibition where they can be looked at as if they were museum artefacts, but at the same time reflected upon as if they were myths and legends and things that we've told our children so they can tell their children, and so on and so forth for thousands of years. Myths like Medusa and Icarus and the Minotaur and all of these different things, and the babes in the wood and mermaids and fairies and these magical creatures that are still around and have been for hundreds of years and are in many, many cultures, in many, many different places in society, something we can all reflect with, something that we can all empathise with, and then putting them in museum jars so that people can create their own narratives to go alongside these pieces, so people can entwine them together and think about them all in the same context. And at the same time reflect upon the way that we preserve things, the way that we preserve ourselves, the way that we tell stories, and the way that they become twisted quite often, are changed over time, the way that they are developed, but the morals stay the same. The little figures inside will always stay the same, even though they're being viewed by many, many different people in many, many different contexts. So that is my evaluation. I know I need to move forward with my glaze work. I know I need to move forward with the way that I use figurative work, and I am developing it quite a bit. I am looking at different ways of researching things, but it does need work, and that is why I intend to move forward.